We live in a culture, in an age where we pride ourselves on our rights and our freedoms, what we get to do and can do, and the freedom, as we say, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We see it in commercials, we see it in songs, we see it in signs and in slogans. I mean, even when you get arrested, they remind you, you still got rights. You got a right to remain silent. There's your right. And we pride ourselves on our rights. In some degree, we feel that if we don't exert our rights, that we then are opening ourselves up to being taken advantage of. But have you ever considered that you as a believer have a right not to do certain things, even though you could do certain things? It's a wonderful thing to think about. The point is that as we mature in our walk with God, it's going to bring a balance to the liberties that we have. Think about it, a little child. A little child sees a toy that they want, and they kind of assert that right to take that toy. They think about nothing else but themselves. They just want it, it's mine. I'm not thinking about any consequences, any end result, how it might benefit another person or not. I'm just going to take it. But as the child grows up, we then begin to learn that in maturity, there's a balance to your liberties. That though you may have a right to take that toy, it might not be the best thing to do because it could hurt somebody else, it could cause problems down the road, it could lead to this or that. And so we learn to balance the liberties we have because, well, we've matured. And the same thing applies in the Christian walk. As you grow up in Jesus, you find that there are things you could do that you just choose not to do because you think about the effectiveness of the gospel, or you think about the person of Jesus, or you think about how this is going to affect other people. And Paul in chapter 9, coming off of chapter 8, where he talks about balancing out walking in love and liberties, now he gets down a little deeper to his own personal life. And he begins to talk about his own life as an example of maturity and liberty in ministry. And he has the liberty and even the right to ask them to support him. But in Corinth, he refuses. Why? Well, that's what we'll find out here. Chapter 9, starting in verse 1. He says, "Am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If I am not an apostle to others, yet doubtless I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. My defense to those who examine me is this: do we have no right to eat and drink? Do we have no right to take along a believing wife, as do also the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working?" You see, the Greeks prided themselves in not doing manual labor. They were kind of just the thinkers of the day, and they would get others, even the slaves, to do the manual labor. And so here was a situation. The Jews, on the other hand, they thought it necessary that you teach your kids a trade. They said if you didn't teach your kids a trade, you were training them to become a thief. And that it was important. So here was Paul, the rabbi, but also he was a tent maker. He had a trade. And when he came into the city of Corinth, if you remember in the book of Acts, he set up his tent-making business, met Aquila and Priscilla, that couple there, who had come from Rome, and he used his tent-making business to support him so that he was free then to just share the gospel in the city of Corinth. What happened is his unconventional leadership style, you might say, because he worked like a slave and not like the society leaders of the day, the Corinth church began to question Paul's authority and his apostleship. Was he for real? Add to that all the pompous false teachers coming in that were fleecing the flock or fleecing the churches, charging them exorbitant amounts of money, and they were challenging Paul's ministry. And this church in Corinth is just absolutely confused on what the minister and the ministry is supposed to look like. And so Paul, with these questions, he lays out 7 questions, basically showing them that he's worthy to be called their pastor. The first one is a question of authority. Am I not an apostle? And of course, that word simply means sent one. Primarily, it referred to the 12 that Jesus sent out, but it also refers to the ministry of those who might be sent out to plant churches, a little A, you might say. And the church was saying, Paul, you're not an A-apostle, you're not even a B-apostle. I don't know who you are anymore, if you have that right. And of course, Paul was in this place. He knew he was sent by the Spirit of God. Acts chapter 13 tells us. The Spirit said, separate unto me Paul and Barnabas for the work of ministry that I've called them to do. And I think it's important for every minister to note that you must be called by God into ministry. You don't take it upon yourself. You need to be sent by the Lord to do those aspects of ministry. Number 2, there was a question of ability. Am I not free, he says. Free as a Roman citizen, this man was. Ability to move around freely. Freed by Christ to serve him in this way. And even free to let his love rule over those liberties. The third is a question of testimony. Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? You see, one of the credentials for a church plant at the very beginning, the one who would go out and start a church, was that they had personally seen Jesus Christ. And Paul is saying, I've seen him. They're on the road to Damascus. I saw him. It was not a vision. I saw the person of Jesus Christ. And I think every person who goes into ministry must, in a sense, personally have had a connection with Jesus Christ. You cannot teach something that hasn't already gripped you first. It has to flow out from your own relationship with the Lord. And so the fourth question is a question of legacy. Are you not my work in the Lord? And though the others may criticize Paul's person and his work, all this church had to do was look at the proof is in the pudding. Look at yourself. I spent 18 months with you guys. Look at what God has done in your life from beginning till now. Isn't that not enough evidence to show you that I'm legit? Every minister also needs that same legacy as well. You begin to look at the disciples of Jesus Christ as they grow in him and go for him. The fifth is a question of liberty. As he says in verse 3, he feels like he's on the defense stand, examined before them. And he continues, do we not have a right to eat and drink that is free to eat at the expense of the church? And verse 7 is going to explain a little bit more about that. The sixth question is of matrimony. Do we have no right to take along a believing wife? Now, Peter, who is Cephas, was married along with the other apostles. Now, if you come from a Catholic background, they have told you that no, he was celibate his whole life. Paul is referring to the fact that Peter was married. And when he went around and did his ministry, he took along his wife with him. And the churches supported that. And they took wives as they did ministry, and the whole family was supported. And if they did it, Paul, in a sense, can't I? In verse 6, he says, or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working? This is a flexibility. If Peter and James and a couple other apostles and ministers were supported by the church, and then why is it that Paul says, why is it that Barnabas and I are the only ones that have to still work? He's laying these things out to show them that he has a legitimate right to be supported by this church. But as we'll see, he chooses not to. You would think that their choice to not be a burden to the church in Corinth here would make them more respected. But in a sense, the Corinthian church here, it had an opposite effect. They began to say, since you don't ask for support here like other people have, maybe you're not legitimate. Now, let me put it in modern day language. Calvary North, since you don't take second offerings and you don't do pledge drives and fundraising and stuff like that, maybe you're really not a legitimate church. You think, wait a second, that's kind of twisted reasoning. Shouldn't you go, wow, isn't it amazing that they don't do that stuff? And they just say, hey, you know what, it's let God lead, and where God guides, he provides, and we'll give you full information, no solicitation. Let's just see what the Lord does. And here we are 37 years later. But you're still not legitimate. Whatever. To the Lord we stand. But it does bring up the question, should a church support ministers and ministries? And sometimes a church can't support a pastor, and so he works outside the church to provide for his family, and that's okay. But if a church can support its ministers, I believe they should. Why? because it's not only a benefit to the current local body, it's a benefit in the community, and it's also a benefit globally as the gospel goes out. It's a good thing. We know that Paul received support from the Philippian church, but here in Corinth, he says, I don't want it. So having ended with examining his personal ministry and work, he now goes into some aspects of ministry regarding support here in verses 7 through 14. He says, whoever goes to war at his own expense, who plants a vineyard and does not eat its own fruit, or who tends a flock and does not drink of the milk of the flock. Do I say these things as a mere man, or does not the law say the same also? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. Is it oxen God is concerned about? Or does he say it altogether for our sakes? For our sakes, no doubt. This is written that he who plows should plow in hope, and he who threshes in hope should be partakers of his hope. If we have sown spiritual things for you, is it a great thing if we reap your material things? If others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? Nevertheless, we have not used this right, but endure all things lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who minister the holy things eat of the things in the temple, and those who serve at the altar partake of the offerings of the altar? Even so, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. His point that he's making is that it's not wrong to be supported in ministry. Why? He gives 4 things. The first one is a very logical consideration. He says in verse 7, soldiers are supported in war. When they go to war, they are fed and supported, in a sense, by their government. A pilot doesn't go purchase his own plane to go to battle. A naval captain does not go and buy a ship in order to fight the battles. A farmer, when he does his work, partakes a little bit of the crops as he goes, and so does a shepherd. Is it not logical to think that a minister in his ministry would take part in that too? It's a very logical thing that he brings about. The second one is a biblical. In verses 8 through 11, he goes back to the law to point out in Deuteronomy 25, verse 4, an oxen eats as it works. Why? Because it would be cruel not to, in a sense, and it would, at the same time, it gives the energy to do the work well. And Paul points out that, listen, he wasn't writing to oxen because oxen can't read. This was written for you and I to take consideration that when we do the work of ministry, that we have this hope as we share in it, partake of it, of the work that God is doing. And that's a good thing to consider. It's biblical. Not just in the law, but in the temple, verse 13, he points out, in the temple, it illustrates it as well. The priests in the temple eat the offerings as they ministered, as they went out and did that. The people were supporting them by their offerings, and they continued the ministry forward. This is what God established biblically. The third thing that points to the reason for support is it's cultural. Look at verse 12 at the beginning of it, when he says there, if others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? It was a cultural thing that they supported aspects of ministry, even there in Corinth. Of course, Paul's referring to the false teachers who were coming in and fleecing the church, but it was a part of their culture to do that. And then the last thing he gives is in verse 14, that it is personal. Look at what he says there. Even so, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should live from the gospel. If he commanded to support it. Luke chapter 10, verse 7, he says, as he sent out 70 missionaries, he told them to stay in the houses, eating and drinking such things as they give you, for the laborer is worthy of his wages. So if our Lord told us personally to do it, then that kind of seals it permanently. So we see that it's logical, it's biblical, it's cultural, and it's personal, in a sense, to do these things. Paul took this in 1 Timothy chapter 5 as he's exhorting Timothy. He says the same thing. He says, let the elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in the word and doctrine. For the scripture says, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain, and the laborer is worthy of his wages. And the double honor is in context of a financial support. He said earlier in that chapter in 1 Timothy 5 verse 3 to honor widows, that is to support widows. And now he's saying, hey, double honor your elders and care for them as well. It's a godly thing to do. It is a biblical idea that we need to support the needy and the poor. Jesus tells us to do that. That's a biblical thing. That's a right thing. That every church, in a sense, should have a benevolence ministry where we can minister to those needs that come up. But I've heard believers say this, and it happens at times. Some people just say, you know what, well, I'll just give to the poor because that's a better thing than giving to the church. In fact, I think the church should take all its money and just distribute it all to the poor. I've heard that. It's a heartwarming thing, maybe, but it's not very thought out biblically. We all know at times that sometimes you can give to the poor and it doesn't actually help the poor, it can hinder the poor. So it's not just a monetary thing that's needed, it's a ministry thing that's needed, and that has to be done in a right way. In other words, when Paul lays this out, and when the Bible lays this out, it's not meant to be an either-or type of thing, it's meant to be a both. Oh, let's do both. Let's minister to the poor, and let's also support ministries so that the gospel can go forth. But the question arises then, why would a believer not support a ministry or minister? Outside of the obvious things, hey, I don't have any money, duh, or bad reputation or falsities in practice, there are a few things to consider here. Look at verse 11 and also verse 12. There's two things that he lists there. If he says, if we have sown a spiritual things for you, is it a great deal if we reap your material things? In other words, I think because of a misunderstanding of ministry, people don't support it. Let me clarify that they don't value the spiritual on the same plane as the material. And that happens. That can happen. Some believers get so focused on this world that they never think about the next. They never think about the value of eternity and the spiritual things because the material is so tangible in front of them. They have found in recent studies that only 10 to 25% of a normal congregation tithes. Christians are only giving at 2.5% per person. And that's just the facts. We're not doing any pledge drives. No, I'm just giving you the reality here. This doesn't lead up to anything. This is just where we're at in the scriptures. But the point is that those of you who have seen the value of the spiritual and have, in a sense, invested in the kingdom of God because you're working for the eternal, you've seen the joy and the blessing it is. You understand that we are working for something far greater than ourselves, and there's a legacy that's left, even in your family and others, that Christ is a priority. The kingdom of God is important. Jesus is ultimately what we want people to see. And when we support that ministry, that's what we're saying. We're saying, I want to see the gospel go through you, this place, that arena, to reach others. I want to see discipleship. I want to see people blessed and people ministered to. And so, yeah, that's what God's called us to do. Sometimes there is a misunderstanding of the ministry. Secondly, sometimes people don't support a ministry in verse 12 because of the abuses in the ministry around them. As he says there, if others are partakers of this right over you, are we not even more? The false teachers came into Corinth charging and gouging the people financially, and the Corinthian church was putting up with it, thinking, well, that's just the right thing to do. They were supporting them, but not Paul. And so Paul, in a sense, says, if you allow these false teachers this right, how much more should we have the right since we're your true ministers? If it's your custom to support ministers, then what's the big deal if I ask for that support? Some believers support wrong ministries. Some refuse to support ministry because of abuses they've encountered or they've seen on TV. That happens. They think a minister is misusing funds and using it for selfish gain, or it's the opposite, that the minister doesn't deserve anything nice because he's committed to ministry, and so that's part of the call. I was talking to a minister one day, and he was sharing this story of how someone in his church came to him and said, you know what, I don't think that's a good thing for you to buy that barbecue, 2-burner barbecue. He wanted to buy it because he wanted to minister to people and have them over for dinner, and this guy was scrutinizing things. I don't think that's what you need to do. In other words, what he's saying is I'm not supporting your salary to have you buy things I don't think are necessary. And you kind of go, good grief. I just wanted to cook a burger for a friend who's coming over for lunch. But sometimes that's what happens. It's sad to see how misunderstandings of the ministry and abuses in the ministry can hinder people from the wonderful joy of partnering in what God is doing. It really is a joy. I've seen it my whole life, watching the Lord do great things. And a privilege, in a sense, to say, yeah, you know what? I do support that. I am blessed to support that because I see the fruit. It's great. And the kingdom of God is advancing. And though there's a right to be supported, look at the maturity Paul has. I love this in verse 12. Look at the second half of it. Nevertheless, we have not used this right, but endure all things lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. He says the same thing in verse 15. But I have used none of these things, nor have I written these things that it should be done so to me, for it would be better for me to die than that anyone should make my boasting void. So Paul says this, in his maturity, he says, they may fleece you, but I won't. I may have liberty to be supported by you. It's logical, it's biblical, it's cultural, and even personally, Jesus tells us to. But he says, in this instance, it's not doable. Why? I'm not going to use this route, and I'm not going to write that this is what has to be done everywhere, because he says, I know right here that you are a hurting church. And I am concerned about the Spirit of God's work in you and the gospel in this place. And so for right here in this city, I'm not going to do that. It's quite a move. Why did Paul take this course? Well, verse 12 tells us this course for Corinth. It's only here that he did this because of love's work in verse 12. He says, we haven't used this right, but endure all things lest we hinder the gospel of Christ. Listen, love doesn't hinder the gospel. We have to recognize that. The work of the gospel is most important, Paul might say. It's not my comforts, it's not the cash, it's not the liberties that I would exercise, and so I'm choosing to take the lack so that the gospel can freely go about in this place because I love you. And some people have looked at this and thought that meant that ministers should never be supported financially because Paul did it here in Corinth. But they miss another verse that Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 11:8, where in a sense he says, I have somewhat robbed other churches so that you didn't have to support. In other words, here's a guy who comes into the city and says, you know what, the Lord's provided for my needs. And so I don't want to put that burden on you. I just want to be free to bless you guys. And they began to look at him going, what's wrong with you? It's kind of a cool approach. The mature minister can say that at times, you know, God's provided already. Let's not worry about the financial stuff. Let's just do the work of ministry. And yet at the same time, he was also supported by other churches, and that's why he was free to do this in Corinth. It's a powerful testimony how love rules over liberties and how the gospel is key in it all. The second thing in verse 15, he says that your witness of integrity in ministry is priceless. When he talks about, I've used none of these things, nor have I written these things that it should be done to me, for it would be better for me to die than anyone should make my boasting void. He says, I'm a man of integrity. And when I leave this place, I want the gospel to be known. I don't want the finances to get in the way. And so I'm choosing to stand on those grounds. It's important, I think, that when people have been hurt by various abuses and stuff of ministries, that you do have a sensitivity to that there's a gentleness in the approach. You know, Calvary North here, we aren't driven by money. You're not going to find somebody knocking on your door saying, hey, you didn't give. You're not going to find, as I've mentioned, a second offering, or we're doing this type of thing because we just need more money. And I've been to places that do that, and they stand before God, not me. But for us, for 37 years, it has been the simple thing that we'll give full information, but no solicitation. We trust that where God guides, that he provides. And so the Lord lays it on people's heart to give and to support the work of ministry here. And it has gone that way for 37 years. And there's no need to change because the testimony is great. Amen. I have talked with other pastors that have different drives and stuff like that, and I'm curious to go, what in the world? How do you do that? How does that even work? I've seen the seminars and I get the emails and everything, and you just kind of throw your hands in the air to go, you know what? It's God's church. And I love that there isn't that pressure. Oh, make sure the people give, because I wouldn't be very good at it in the first place. I'm a bad salesman. It's more like, hey, you know what? I'll just give it all away. That's better. But I love Paul's approach here. It's a good thing to understand that in maturity, in ministry, we can say no. We have the right to say, you know what? We're not going to do that in this case. Verse 16, he goes on and he says, for if I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast of, for necessity is laid upon me. Yes, woe is me if I do not preach the gospel. God gave him this calling. And he, in a sense, says, you know what? Woe is me if I just don't do what God's called me to do. That I don't have to put the screws to you to give. I mean, I can be free in that. He's given me, he's entrusted me with this. Ministry is serious work in God's eyes, but it's not always fun. Look at what he says in verse 17. For if I do this willingly, I have a reward, but if against my will, I have been entrusted with a stewardship. And sometimes ministry is done simply because of the calling alone. You've all faced things in life where you say, man, I just don't feel like doing it. You know that happens in ministry too? Man, I'm tired. I just don't feel like doing it. But you still do it. Why? Because you know that's what God's called you to do. It's like taking care of your parents. Some of you have taken care of your parents in their days and ages as they get older, and you're going, man, I just don't feel like it. But I'm still going to do it. Why? Because that's the right thing to do. It's part of the calling. Some of you are nudging your younger kids going, yeah, you're going to take care of me. It's the calling. It's the ministry aspect. It's what God's entrusted you. And a maturity in ministry will not only put restraints on the liberties you can and cannot do, but at times you end up finding yourself doing what you're supposed to do because that's what God's called you to do. Verse 18, he says, what then is my reward? That when I preach the gospel, I may present the gospel of Christ without charge, that I may not abuse my authority in the gospel. You know, in those tough times when you're not feeling up to it, what I've learned is you got to look deeper than just the present. You got to look deeper than what you're seeing right now. Lord, I just don't feel like doing that aspect of ministry. What I found personally is I have to sit back and go, okay, God, what are you wanting to do in me right here today? There's character you want to develop. And what are you doing down the road in this aspect of ministry that there may be fruit down the road? We're so fixated with the present. We're so fixated at times with whether we feel like it or not. That there's times when the Lord says, I want you to do this, even though you may not feel like it. I'm compelling you to do this, but you need to see that there's character being worked in you now, and there's a future that's going to happen down the road, and you're simply planting the seeds for it. Amen. And if we can grab that, okay, that's valuable for me because my character is being reproved and refined through this, and that's valuable for me because I know I may be planting a seed that somewhere down the road, there's a Billy Graham coming down the road. If you could see down the road, you would say, well, you bet I feel like it now. We saw last week as we did the memorial for Billy Graham. How many of you guys heard of Mordecai Ham? Wow, you amaze me because you've read it in books. Most people don't know that name. But you go, you know, that was the guy who led Billy Graham to Christ. Woo. And you think, wow, the Lord put upon his heart to say, you know what, hey, Mordecai, I want you to do this little tent revival here in this countryside. We're back in the hills. And by the way, I'm not telling you that there's going to be one of the greatest evangelists that ever stepped foot on the face of the earth that's going to come out of your ministry. Oh, now I feel like it. But he's just faithful to do what God put before him, leaving the results in the Lord's hands. Listen, God's always working on your character in the present. He's refining you for the day of glory when he will come, 1 Peter tells us. But what he's doing in the present that you may not even feel like doing, when you step forward to say, Lord, let your will be done and not mine, you're going to find he's also planting seeds in the future as he uses your life and someone else's. It's a good thing. And so in a sense, Paul says, listen, I am free to ask for support from you, but I won't. I'm not going to charge you for the gospel in Corinth, and I will not resort to gimmicks or games to get people to support me like others do. I'm not going to abuse that authority God gave me to line any pockets. I don't want to stumble someone in my efforts to reach them with this great message of salvation. And so he was free. He had the right not to. And sometimes I think we have to take that into consideration, that we have the right not to as well. What rights do you give up so that Jesus can be clearly seen through you? I know some of you I've talked to, and you have chosen not to climb the ladder of success, so to speak, at business because you knew it would pull you away from your family. And so you said, no, I'm going to take the lesser job because I want to minister to my family and have that time with them. Hey, that's maturity. I'm not saying it's not wrong, but it's something the Lord laid on your heart that you chose to do. You had the liberty to climb the ladder, but you chose not to because of a love. And that's a good thing. I know some of you that have told your bosses, say, hey, you can work me 6 days a week, but 7 on Sunday, that's my day for the Lord. And if you want me to have this job, you need to honor that Sunday, that I need to have that time for my family and for the Lord. And you've seen God honor it, and maybe you've seen God, the guy say, hey, you're not the guy for the job. That's maturity in your walk with God. Maybe some of you have said, well, this week or at this time or this stage of my life, I'm gonna skip out on one meal a day, and I'm gonna take those funds that I would have used for that meal, and I'm gonna give it to somebody else that they may be blessed through it. That's a maturity in ministry. It's not a standard you throw across that everybody has to obey. It's just what God put upon your heart, that you're using maturity in your liberties for the sake of ministry. I remember years ago, 25 years ago, I gave up a scholarship to college to pursue a course of ministry. And I remember the friends and the people saying, that's kind of a stupid thing to do. Well, hey, you only live once. And now I don't think it's that stupid 25 years later. The Lord knew what he was doing. And when you respond to what the Spirit is doing in your life for that particular moment, it can be an incredible thing, an incredible working. Because here what Paul did in Corinth, only in Corinth, set something for us to consider in our day and age, that when God leads us in certain things, yeah, listen, it may be a logical and it may be a cultural and it may be a biblical thing to do, but you still have this right by the Spirit to say, you know what, in love, I'd much rather just say no. You don't have to. And let the gospel go where it needs to go.